Welcome to the morning when German troops learned the impossible could happen, that American Sherman tanks could strike from behind. Not from the beaches they had watched for days, but from the quiet, mist-choked fields they thought were safe. June 1944. Normandy. The air smelled of smoke and wet soil. In the distance, the muffled thunder of artillery rolled over the hedgerows, echoing like a heartbeat. Crows scattered above shattered orchards, and somewhere through fog and fear, engines began to growl. German sentries turned toward the sea, still believing danger would come from the surf. But the sound grew louder from behind them. Steel treads crushing branches, exhaust fumes seeping through morning mist. Then the first flash. A turret turned from the rear flank. One shell, one scream, and the impossible had arrived. In less than a heartbeat, order dissolved into panic. "Sie kommen von hinten. They're coming from behind." Radios crackled, voices overlapped. Disbelief turned into chaos. The front had vanished. The battlefield itself had flipped. And as the fog swallowed the cries of the wounded, history rewrote itself in real time. What had begun as a counterattack became a legend whispered in every bunker that day, that the Shermans had outflanked the impossible. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Imagine hearing engines in the fog behind you, when every map, every order, every instinct told you the enemy could only come from the sea. June 1944, Normandy. The morning air was thick, damp, and heavy with the scent of gunpowder and wet grass. The hedgerows stretched endlessly, ancient green walls rising from the earth, their roots tangled like veins of the land itself. Mist drifted between them like ghosts. Every few seconds, the dull echo of distant artillery rolled over the countryside, a low, unending growl that seemed to come from beneath the soil. What had once been a peaceful region of farmers and stone cottages had become a living labyrinth of death. Every lane, every ditch, every orchard hid a waiting gun. The Germans had turned the land into a fortress, confident that no army could move faster or smarter through its tangled veins. But the rhythm of the invasion had changed. The great thunder of D-Day, that roaring tide of ships and men, had given way to something quieter, colder, more deliberate. The chaos had settled into strategy. The Allied soldiers who once crawled across sand now crawled through hedges, mud, and smoke. And with every passing day, the front blurred. There was no longer a clear before or behind. Normandy was becoming a place where sound lied, where the sky was the same color as fear, and where victory meant surviving another night. The Germans, certain of their geography, believed they held the upper hand. They knew every bend in the road, every stone wall, every patch of soft ground where a tank might sink. For weeks they had dug in anti-tank guns buried in hedgerows, artillery hidden behind barns, mines scattered across the roads like invisible sentinels. They waited for the Americans to come straight at them, as every playbook predicted. And for a while that was exactly what happened. The first Shermans that rolled inland from the beaches met a nightmare. Their armor, designed for mobility, not endurance, could not withstand the German 88s. The Tigers and Panthers outgunned them in every way: thicker plates, longer barrels, sharper optics. Allied commanders watched tank after tank burst into flames, black smoke coiling into the sky like funeral banners. The German officers wrote in their reports that the American tanks were brave but doomed, lumbering machines destined to die in the hedgerows. And yet somewhere between the horror and the smoke, adaptation began. It started small. In a field near Carentan, US, engineers stared at the walls of earth that blocked every road. These hedgerows, hundreds of years old, were nearly impossible to breach. Tanks that tried to climb them exposed their thin underbellies, easy prey for the German guns waiting on the other side. But one man, Sergeant Curtis Colin, had an idea crude, desperate, and brilliant. Using scrap metal from destroyed landing craft, he welded saw-toothed blades to the front of a Sherman. The first time he tested it, the tank sliced through the hedge like a steel beast tearing through bone. Within days, dozens of these modified tanks, the Rhino Shermans, began to appear across the front. That was when the war in Normandy changed. The hedgerows that had protected the Germans now betrayed them. The Shermans could move silently between fields, breaking through walls where no path existed. They became ghosts appearing from unexpected angles, vanishing into smoke, reappearing where no sentry had been posted. German anti-tank crews trained to aim toward the beaches suddenly found shells tearing into their flanks. Bunkers that had faced east were struck from the west. Machine gunners turned their barrels too late. The battle map the Germans trusted their geometry of defense dissolved into chaos. Oberleutnant Karl Heine of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division wrote in his diary, "They move where no tank should move. The earth itself betrays us." His words, scratched in fading ink, capture the sense of disbelief that spread through the German lines. They had been told that the American Shermans were inferior, clumsy, fragile, easy to destroy. But in those weeks, something else emerged from the fog. Not superior technology, but relentless ingenuity. Night fell over the hedgerows like a shroud. The fields glowed faintly from burning fuel and tracer fire. The crickets had stopped singing days ago. Only the distant rumble of engines filled the dark. Sometimes it was impossible to tell whether the sound came from friend or foe. Men slept with their rifles across their chests, dreaming of home and waking to the cold slap of rain on their helmets. The war no longer had clear front lines, only shifting whispers, ambushes, and echoes. Somewhere near St. Lo, Captain Robert Red Delaney of the 2nd Armored Division studied his map under a dim lantern. The lines drawn by higher command made no sense anymore. Every road was blocked, every direct path covered by German guns. But the hedgerows, those towering walls of green, hid something else: opportunity. Delaney traced a thin farm track on the edge of the map, barely wide enough for a jeep. If they could move through it, dragging the Shermans one by one, they could circle behind the enemy line by dawn. It was madness. It was genius. At midnight, the engines coughed to life. One by one, the tanks began to crawl through the darkness, guided by the faint reflection of moonlight on the wet leaves. Men rode on the hulls, whispering directions, ducking branches that brushed their helmets. They couldn't use headlights, not a single spark of light could betray them. The smell of diesel mixed with the damp earth. Somewhere ahead, a dog barked and then fell silent. Every sound seemed too loud. Every heartbeat felt like thunder. They moved all night. The hedgerows tore at the sides of the tanks, scraping paint, ripping canvas. Mud splashed against their faces. Every few minutes, someone thought they heard a German patrol and froze, breath held, fingers tightening on triggers. But the night held them. It carried them forward. When the first light of dawn bled through the mist, they were behind enemy lines. The Germans in the village ahead had no idea. They were facing east, their guns pointed toward where the Americans should be. Their officers were sipping bitter coffee, scanning the horizon that was now meaningless. And then came the first shell, a single violent eruption that shattered the stillness and sent men running in every direction. Delaney's Shermans had arrived from the one place no one had thought to look. In less than 30 minutes, the German defenses collapsed. Machine gun nests were obliterated from behind mortar teams scattered in panic. One officer tried to rally his men, shouting over the noise, but the roar of the tanks drowned his words. Villagers later said it sounded like thunder coming from the wrong side of the sky. By the time the smoke cleared, the field that had been Germany's stronghold was a graveyard of burning steel. The air shimmered with heat, The hedgerows smoldered, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not for victory, not yet, but for confusion. That morning marked a turning point. It wasn't a massive offensive or a grand victory written in the books of generals. It was something smaller, almost invisible, a shift in momentum, in imagination. The Germans no longer trusted the ground beneath their boots. The Americans no longer saw themselves as trapped by terrain. The hedgerows, once symbols of protection, had become the walls of a cage, and so the war in Normandy breathed differently that day. The fog moved like a living thing. The tanks spoke in thunder and fire. And in that strange, brutal silence that followed, the kind that comes after the noise dies, but before the memory sets in, a new truth took shape across the fields of France. The hunters had become the hunted. And the battle was only beginning. The land itself, soaked in dew and blood, whispered the warning the Germans had ignored, that nothing in war stays where it's supposed to. The front, the flank, the rear. In Normandy, they all became one. And somewhere in that fog, the Shermans kept moving. By mid-June 1944, Normandy had become a maze of mudfire and whispered rumors. The invasion that began as thunder from the sea had turned into a war of inches and data. Numbers, cold, brutal numbers, began to define the rhythm of death. More than 1.5 million men had crossed the Channel within 2 weeks. Over 300,000 tons of supplies had been unloaded onto the beaches, now turned into floating cities of steel. Each morning, the U.S. Army's logistics reports read like grim poetry: 12,000 tons of fuel, 20,000 tons of ammunition, 2,000 tanks and vehicles lost or damaged. The air smelled of cordite and bureaucracy. Victory measured not in courage but in tonnage. The Office of War Analysis described the region as a tactical nightmare and an engineering miracle. Every hedgerow, every field required new rules. The tanks, the Shermans, those 30-ton machines of compromise, had to learn to crawl like beasts of the earth. Crews welded on improvised armor plates, spare track links bolted across the front, sandbags stacked along the sides to absorb the shock of German shells. In theory, the Sherman's 75mm gun was no match for the Tiger's long-barreled .88. In practice, the Americans discovered something far more important: agility. The battlefield was not a plain, it was a puzzle. German artillery positions, calibrated for long-distance duels, struggled to find targets they could not see. The Shermans, moving in short bursts through hedgerows and low mists, began to use the terrain as camouflage. A tank's engine would roar, vanish, reappear 30 meters away. By the time a German gunner found his range, the target was already gone. What was once a weakness, their thin armor, became a kind of freedom. They didn't need to win in a straight fight. They only needed to appear where no one expected them to be. Military records from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division show that between June 12th and June 25th, over 400 German armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned across the Cotentin Peninsula. Of those, nearly half were not the result of direct combat, but of ambush, retreat, or mechanical failure under relentless pressure. The German command, once precise and disciplined, began to fracture. Orders sent from divisional headquarters were outdated by the time they reached the front. Lines of communication, so vital to German doctrine, dissolved in the confusion of broken roads, shattered bridges, and constant Allied bombing. In a report dated June 20th, General Friedrich Dollmann wrote to his superior in despair: "We can no longer distinguish front from flank. The enemy does not advance, he appears." That single sentence captured the psychological collapse unfolding across the German ranks. The maps on their tables, the beautifully drawn symbols of divisions and corps, no longer described the world outside. The war had slipped through the cracks of their planning. Meanwhile, American war engineers, the unsung architects of the invasion, kept feeding the machine. Each day, 500 new tanks arrived from England. Each night, ship convoys slipped through the channel, guided by radar and protected by destroyers. Behind every Sherman that rumbled through the French countryside, there was a trail of invisible labor mechanics, welders, fuel convoys, and the floating docks at Mulberry Harbor, where waves of supply ships poured their contents into the veins of war. The German soldiers at the front faced an enemy that never seemed to run out of fuel, of ammunition, of men. The German army, though formidable, was running on fumes. Hitler's high command had diverted much of its armor to the Eastern Front, where the Red Army was pushing west with terrifying speed. What remained in France were veteran divisions stretched thin, exhausted, their supply lines strangled by Allied air superiority. Luftwaffe fighters rarely appeared anymore. The skies belonged to the Americans and the British. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, hunting anything that moved: trucks, tanks, trains, even bicycles. By late June, the German army in Normandy had lost over 40% of its transport vehicles. The men on the ground were stranded, fighting, blind, deaf, and hungry. And yet, they held on. The Waffen-SS, the Panzer Lehr, the remnants of Rommel's once proud 7th Army, they fought with a kind of doomed precision. At Saint-Lô, at Villers-Bocage, they ambushed columns of Shermans, destroying dozens in minutes. German gunners still spoke the language of discipline: one shell, one kill, but the math was turning against them. For every Panther, they fielded 10 Shermans rolled from the factories in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Chicago. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, would later admit, "We were fighting not an army, but an economy." The Sherman was not the best tank. It was not the strongest. It was not even the most feared. But it was everywhere. Its engine's growl became the sound of inevitability. And its crew's ordinary farm boys and mechanics from Kansas, Pennsylvania, and Oregon became part of something far greater than themselves. They were not just soldiers. They were the moving embodiment of industrial will. Official field data from June 26th showed that in 1 week, the 3rd Armored Division fired over 25,000 rounds of tank ammunition, an average of 3 shells every 7 seconds around the clock. That kind of firepower wasn't sustainable by courage alone. It required ships, ports, factories, logistics, an entire civilization turned into an assembly line for survival. To the Germans, the numbers must have felt like an illusion. How could so many tanks appear so fast? How could they replace what was destroyed each morning by the afternoon? The answer lay in a single word that haunted every German report: Nachschub, resupply. The Allies had it. The Germans did not. But the most shocking data came from the ground itself. By mid-July, Allied engineers had mapped the advance of every tank, every hedgerow, every destroyed farm. They discovered a strange pattern. The American lines were expanding, not forward, but sideways. The Shermans weren't charging straight north as expected. They were spreading, flanking, consuming ground like a slow-moving tide. German analysts couldn't understand it. Their doctrines were built on direction, not diffusion. The enemy wasn't breaking through, he was surrounding. And beneath all these figures in the pages of field logs and command diaries, a darker pattern emerged. Entire platoons reported hearing tank engines behind them, when no such tanks were recorded nearby. Civilians told stories of phantom tanks, machines that appeared from the mist and vanished without trace. To the soldiers, it was psychological warfare. To historians, it was the moment when technology and terrain merged into myth. The American armor had learned the land, and the land had learned to hide them. By late June, the reports reached London. Eisenhower's analysts noted an eerie shift. The German command has lost orientation. They fight without direction. Their front is in every direction. Numbers had turned into fear, fear into silence, and silence into retreat. In the calm after each battle, When the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, the same image repeated itself. Shermans parked in fields of charred wheat, their engines idling, the crews sitting silently on the hulls staring at the horizon. Behind them, the beaches. Ahead of them, the unknown. The data told one story, the outcome of an industrial war, but the eyes of those men told another, the cost of turning machinery into destiny. And somewhere in Berlin, a general studying his maps realized what his soldiers had been trying to tell him for days. The Americans weren't attacking the front. They were erasing it. The German army still believed the war could be contained within lines east-west, front-rear. But in Normandy, the concept of direction had died. The Shermans were not just advancing, they were reshaping the meaning of movement itself. The numbers would never explain how it felt to hear steel from behind. But history, cold, quiet history, would record it just the same. The fog never really left Normandy. It just thinned enough to let men see what they feared. In the early hours before dawn, Sergeant Daniel McAllister wiped the sweat from his palms and tried to steady his breathing. The inside of the Sherman smelled like oil metal and breath. He could hear the soft ticking of the engine cooling down after hours of idle silence. Outside, nothing. Only the sound of dew dripping from leaves, the faint sigh of wind passing through hedgerows. Somewhere nearby, a cow moaned, terrified by the smell of smoke and death that lingered across the fields. McAllister was 26. He had been a farmhand in Ohio before the war, used to the hum of tractors, not the roar of tanks. But after months of training, this machine had become his world. He could feel every vibration, every tremor through his boots. The Sherman was alive, breathing through its vents, whispering through its gears. He tapped the steel wall beside him as if to remind it and himself that they were still here, still moving, still human. "Steady, Danny?" His gunner, Corporal Ruiz, murmured beside him, his voice low, strained. Ruiz was younger, 21, from New Mexico. He carried a St. Christopher medal on a chain, rubbing it between his fingers whenever the air grew too quiet. Their driver, Wallace, was humming softly under his breath, an old blues tune that no one recognized, but everyone pretended to know. It was the kind of hum that filled silence with something that wasn't fear. Through the commander's hatch, McAllister saw the first hint of light breaking through the mist. A thin gray veil spread across the land, and beyond it, the faint outline of the hedgerow. Their orders were simple on paper: move west through the corridor, flank the German position near the crossroads, and wait for air support. But nothing about Normandy was simple. The maps lied. The roads shifted. The landmarks disappeared under shellfire. Somewhere behind those walls of green, an enemy waited, quiet, patient, invisible. He leaned closer to the radio. "Eagle 1 to all units. Hold position until signal." Static hissed. No reply. Just a crackle like breath through teeth. The radio lines were dying again. Somewhere another unit had moved too far and lost contact. It didn't matter. Orders were already written in instinct now. Ruiz adjusted the gun elevation. The shell slid into place with a solid metallic click. Wallace flexed his fingers on the levers. The tank felt heavier somehow, like it knew what was coming. They moved forward slow, cautious, the engine purring just above a whisper. Each turn of the track crushed grass, broke branches, tore roots. Every sound felt like it could summon death. A bird startled from a tree, and all three men flinched. McAllister raised his hand instinctively. Stop. Silence again. The hedgerow loomed ahead, a thick wall of tangled leaves and dirt, as tall as the tank itself. On the other side, they knew were Germans, maybe a machine gun nest, maybe worse. McAllister nodded at Ruiz. The young gunner mouthed a silent prayer, then pressed his cheek to the scope. "On your mark," he whispered. McAllister took a deep breath. Go. The Sherman lunged forward. The steel teeth welded to its nose, bit into the hedge soil, exploded upward, roots snapping like bone. The tank burst through the wall in a shower of mud and leaves. The world flipped from green to gray to red. German voices screamed shouts of alarm, gunfire bursting in every direction. Ruiz fired before he could see. The first shell hit something hard, a truck maybe, and the blast sent fragments spinning through the air. Wallace pushed the engine forward, smashing through the wreckage. Left, left. McAllister yelled, his throat raw. The turret spun the barrel, roaring again. Another explosion, closer this time. The shockwave slammed through their ribs. Ruiz coughed, spat blood, kept firing. Outside, the Germans tried to rally. A pair of machine guns opened up from a barn tracers, slicing the fog. McAllister saw one bullet spark off the hull, another punch through the periscope glass. He ducked instinctively, breath-catching. Back up, reverse, he shouted, but Wallace didn't move. The driver's eyes were wide, fixed on something ahead. Through the smoke, a German half-track was turning its guns, swiveling toward them. For a heartbeat, both machines stared at each other, predator and prey, both made of steel. McAllister's hand moved on instinct. Fire. The shell hit the half-track square in the center. Fire erupted orange and violent, rolling through the barn like a living thing. The screams that followed were brief, human, then silence again. The air was thick with dust and ash. Ruiz slumped back, breathing hard, face streaked with sweat and grime. Wallace's hands shook on the controls. McAllister climbed halfway out of the hatch, scanning the horizon. Smoke curled lazily from the shattered buildings. The hedgerow behind them was gone, reduced to a black scar across the earth. They had come through from behind. The Germans hadn't expected it. Their guns had been aimed the wrong way. Their defense, perfect on paper, was broken in practice. And yet McAllister didn't feel like a victor. He looked at the bodies strewn across the mud, young men in gray uniforms, barely older than Ruiz. A photo fluttered from one of their pockets, a woman holding a child, smiling faintly. He closed his eyes. For a moment, all the thunder and the smoke felt like an echo from another life. The radio crackled. Eagle 1, confirm position. Reinforcements inbound. Hold your line. He pressed the button. His voice came out hoarse. Copy. Target neutralized. We're still here. He looked around the inside of the Sherman, the scratches on the metal, the dried mud, the names carved into the turret with a knife. Wallace had scratched home soon beside a bullet dent. Ruiz had drawn a tiny cross. McAllister smiled weakly, though he didn't believe it. They stayed in that field for hours, waiting for the next wave. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. The ground was warm beneath them. Sometimes they heard movement, distant footsteps, a broken branch, but it was never clear who it was. The war had dissolved the boundaries between hunter and hunted, between front and back. Everything was everywhere. When night came, the fog returned, rolling low over the fields. The moonlight turned the wreckage silver. McAllister climbed out of the hatch, stretching his back, his hands trembling. He could hear frogs croaking somewhere far away, life returning in small, defiant sounds. He looked east toward the beaches where it all began, then west, into the endless dark where it would continue. He whispered to no one in particular. It's not supposed to be this quiet. Ruiz joined him on the hull, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. The glow of the ember reflected in his tired eyes. You think they'll remember this place? He asked softly. McAllister exhaled, watching the smoke vanish into the fog. Only if someone's left to tell it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The world around them was still not peaceful, not safe, just paused. In that moment, they weren't soldiers or enemies or heroes. They were simply men caught between what had already burned and what was still waiting to ignite. Somewhere in the darkness, a single tank engine rumbled to life, distant, steady, moving west. The sound drifted through the fog like a heartbeat. McAllister listened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Let's go," he said quietly. The Sherman stirred again, its engine growling back into motion. The tracks turned, crushing the burnt grass under their weight. As they rolled forward, the fog closed behind them, erasing their path like it had never existed. Only the echoes remained, steel smoke and the whisper of a war that refused to end. And for the German troops waking in the villages ahead, the nightmare was about to begin again. From behind. By the last week of June 1944, the fields of Normandy had become a paradox, a landscape both conquered and trapped. The German High Command still believed the American advance could be contained, that the Allies had stretched themselves too far, that the hedgerows would swallow them whole. But the numbers, the cold arithmetic of war, told another story. The Americans weren't being slowed. They were multiplying. What began as cautious movement had turned into relentless pressure. Roads that had been empty a week before now crawled with convoys of trucks, bulldozers, and tanks. Fuel drums stacked like towers along the ditches. Ammunition boxes piled behind barns where cows once slept. War had industrialized even the silence. The Germans counted their tanks, 400 still operational, along the western line. They were machines of legend, Panthers, Tigers, the armored titans of Europe. But for every one of theirs, the Americans fielded 10. 10 Shermans, light and loud, painted with names of hometowns, Lucky Lady Ohio Express, Hell's Kitchen. They moved not like knights, but like insects, fast, numerous, impossible to swat away. In the reports sent to Berlin, German commanders described the Allied onslaught with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "They build faster than we destroy, one major," wrote his handwriting, breaking across the page. "We kill one, 10 appear." Factories thousands of miles away were dictating the fate of men crouched in French mud. The Chrysler plant in Detroit, once producing cars, now delivered 3 tanks every hour. Ford's assembly lines built engines for machines that men would never see again once they crossed the Atlantic. On paper, Germany had the better machines. In reality, the Americans had endless ones. Quantity had become its own kind of weapon, cold, mechanical, and unstoppable. But superiority in numbers wasn't the only thing changing the war. Something deeper was happening. Something psychological. The German command still fought by rules, by maps, by structure. Orders flowed downward from Berlin through layers of precision, through officers who measured victory in meters gained and positions held. The Americans didn't. They fought by instinct, by adaptation. A lieutenant on the ground could change a plan mid-battle. A tank commander could ignore orders and circle behind the enemy if he saw an opening. In the hedgerows, improvisation became the deadliest weapon. Oberst Wilhelm Richter, defending the sector near St. Lo, recorded in his field notes on June 24th, "They fight like smoke appearing where logic forbids it. We strike at the front, and the fire comes from behind. We close the gap, and they crawl through the earth." His words would later become part of the captured archives studied by Allied historians, proof that the German command understood too late that they were no longer fighting soldiers. They were fighting evolution. In 1 week, the balance of war flipped. German artillery, once so precise, became blind. Allied reconnaissance planes flew day and night, mapping every trench, every gun pit, every fuel depot. For every shell the Germans fired, 10 fell in return. For every field they mined, 5 more were bypassed through the hedges. When the Americans learned to weld the rhino blades to their tanks, those crude iron teeth that tore through the bocage, the last advantage of the defenders vanished. What had been a wall became a door. German anti-tank gunners found themselves facing the wrong direction again and again. Their training told them to expect frontal assaults. Their sights, their bunkers, their firing arcs all pointed toward the east. But the enemy no longer respected direction. The Shermans had learned to move like water around under and behind. By July, entire German platoons were being caught in ambushes from behind their own lines. The 352nd Infantry Division veterans of Omaha Beach reported losing 3 positions in a single morning without understanding how the Americans had entered. One surviving lieutenant described it later: "We were facing the sea, and they came from the hills. We were facing the hills, and they came from the fog." It was more than confusion. It was a collapse of perception. The Germans began to fight ghosts, enemies that appeared from smoke disappeared into mud, tanks that seemed to come from nowhere. Commanders issued orders to turn entire gun batteries backward just to prepare for the impossible. Meanwhile, the Americans were growing bolder. Intelligence units intercepted German radio transmissions, learning the exact frequencies used between battalions. Engineers fitted some Shermans with short-range transmitters mimicking enemy chatter. On several occasions, German officers received fake orders to retreat only to be met with tank fire as they fell back. Warfare had become deception layered on machinery. The numbers reflected the chaos. Between June 6 and July 1, German armored losses in Normandy exceeded 1,200 vehicles, not all destroyed in combat, but abandoned out of fuel or captured. The Allied losses were high too, more than 1,000 tanks crippled or burned, but the difference lay in recovery. The Americans salvaged. They repaired. Mechanics followed the front like surgeons stitching the wounded machines back to life. By contrast, German tanks died where they fell, left behind as monuments of rust. And then came the rain. Late June brought storms across Normandy. The roads turned to rivers of mud. Artillery sank. Trucks slid off embankments. For the Germans, the rain was both a curse and a prayer. They believed it would slow the Allied advance. But the Shermans didn't stop. Their broad tracks, designed for mobility over mud, churned through the fields where heavier Panthers bogged down. What was meant to be a reprieve became another punishment. General Rommel, inspecting the front near Caen, stood silently before a line of abandoned tanks, half submerged, their crews long dead or captured. "We are fighting the clock," he whispered to his aide, "and the clock belongs to them." That line, quiet, almost resigned, captured the essence of the war's transformation. The Germans still fought for ground. The Americans fought for time. Every hour they held, every tank repaired, every hedgerow crossed, brought them closer to inevitability. By the end of June, the German 17th SS Division was reduced to half its strength. Its officers no longer spoke of victory, only of surviving until reinforcements arrived. But reinforcements never came. The Luftwaffe had been torn from the sky. The roads from Paris were shattered by air raids. Bridges collapsed. Fuel depots burned through the night. The Reich's proud war machine had become a ghost running on fumes and faith. Yet even in despair, there were moments of defiance. In one final report before his capture, a German captain wrote, "Our men fight without rest. We are surrounded by machines, not men. They strike from behind, always from behind. The fields move when they move. The fog speaks their names." He was describing not just the battlefield, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where mobility replaced fortification, where speed conquered armor, where surprise was more powerful than size. The Germans had mastered the art of static defense. The Americans had mastered motion. The clash between the two was not just a battle of armies, it was a collision between centuries. The old world, measured in trenches and precision, was collapsing under the weight of a mechanized storm. And still, somewhere beyond the noise, the human heart persisted. In villages reduced to rubble, civilians whispered of the strange thunder that came from every direction. They spoke of Shermans moving like ghosts through orchards of German soldiers running without knowing which way was safety. War had turned the land itself into a living thing, breathing, shifting, learning. The Germans had believed that the hedgerows would defend them. They didn't realize those same hedgerows were teaching the enemy how to win. By the first days of July, the last reports from the German front spoke not of strategy, but of confusion. "The front has dissolved," one colonel wrote. "We no longer know where they come from. The tanks appear in our rear positions. They are everywhere." And in that chaos, in that unraveling of logic, the legend of Normandy was born. The myth that tanks could strike from behind, from impossible angles, through impassable walls, wasn't just rumor. It was the sound of a war changing shape. The Sherman, ugly, underestimated, mass-produced, had done what no general had planned. It had turned the map inside out, and somewhere beneath the roar of engines and the scream of shells, you could almost hear it, the sound of history rewriting itself in steel. By early July 1944, the fields of Normandy had stopped breathing. What had once been hedgerows alive with insects and the hum of life were now walls of smoke, shrapnel, and the metallic scent of blood. The battle that began with thunder from the sea had turned inward, and by the time the fog lifted, it was no longer a fight for territory, but a reckoning between exhaustion and inevitability. The Germans had built their confidence on geometry, on maps, on fixed lines, on the idea that war could be contained within borders drawn in ink. But the Americans had rewritten the language of movement. What the enemy once thought of as behind had become the new front. The sound of engines coming from the rear, that dull rhythmic growl of the Sherman's V8, became the sound of fear itself. Men started firing. Before they saw anything, afraid the enemy was already inside their own perimeter. In those last days before the fall of St. Lo, every German position was haunted by echoes. Tanks striking from impossible angles. Machine guns erupting from hedgerows they'd just cleared. Shadows moving in smoke that refused to fade. It wasn't just a loss of ground, it was a loss of trust in the land itself. At dawn on July 11th, under a pale gray sky, Captain Robert Red Delaney's armored column pushed into the outskirts of St. Lo. The town was a ruin, walls leaning inward, windows blasted into black eyes. The church bell tower had collapsed, its iron cross buried under rubble. The smell of death was everywhere. Burned tires, wet stone, flesh and rain. Delaney's Sherman crawled forward, its treads crunching over broken cobblestones. His men didn't speak anymore. There was nothing left to say. The war had turned their voices into echoes, too. As they rounded the main square, they saw them, German soldiers stumbling through the smoke, disoriented, some without weapons, some carrying wounded comrades. A few tried to raise their rifles out of habit more than hope, but there was no more fight left in them. Delaney ordered his gunner to hold fire. For the first time in weeks, silence stretched longer than a heartbeat. The Germans dropped their weapons one by one. A single officer, young, pale, uniform torn, stepped forward and saluted before surrendering. Delaney stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. The man was no older than Ruiz. Behind them, more Shermans rolled through the fog, endless, rumbling, unstoppable. The sight broke something inside the enemy ranks. What had once been discipline dissolved into instinct, the need to survive. The war in Normandy wasn't ending in a decisive blow, but in 1,000 small surrenders, each one quieter than the last. Albert Speer would later write in The Ruins of Berlin, "We lost not when our tanks burned, but when theirs multiplied." It wasn't strategy that broke the Wehrmacht in Normandy, it was inevitability. Every destroyed Panther meant a dozen Shermans behind it. Every fallen village meant another waiting beyond the trees. The Germans, who had once believed they commanded the tempo of war, now found themselves marching to a rhythm they couldn't slow. But the human cost, the cost no number could measure, lay heavy in the mud. The Americans had paid dearly for their momentum. For every German tank destroyed, dozens of Sherman crews were buried beside them. In the fields outside Carentan, the smell of gasoline mingled with the scent of wildflowers growing through the wreckage. A strange kind of beauty, cruel accidental, covered the graves of both sides. Corporal Ruiz was gone. His Sherman, the Ohio Express, had taken a direct hit days earlier. Delaney found the wreck, later burned black, half-melted, its barrel twisted skyward like a frozen scream. On the side, barely visible through the soot, were 3 words carved with a knife, "Still rolling, sir." Delaney stood there for a long time, helmet in hand. The smoke stung his eyes. He couldn't tell if it was grief or ash. Around him, the fields were quiet, the kind of silence that feels earned, not given. When he finally walked away, he didn't look back. The war was still going, but something inside him had already ended. In the official communiques, the victory at St. Lo was described as a tactical breakthrough. The reports spoke of divisions, supply lines, reinforcements. They didn't mention the exhaustion that crawled into men's bones, or the way the smell of burned rubber clung to their uniforms, or the nights they woke screaming from dreams where engines roared behind them. And yet, there was a kind of revelation buried inside that suffering, the realization that the impossible could be done. The German myth of invincibility had cracked. Their lines were folding inward, their confidence bleeding out faster than their fuel. For the first time, Allied soldiers saw panic in the eyes of their enemies, not the defiance of the old war, but the fear of being hunted. The hunters had become the hunted, and they knew it. It was in those days that Normandy began to whisper its own legend, the story of the tanks that came from behind. Civilians would later tell it in fragments. Farmers swore they saw engines moving through fog without sound. Children claimed to have watched the ground tremble before the tanks appeared, as if the earth itself had turned against the occupiers. Even among German survivors, a strange folklore grew of American tanks that seemed to emerge from the soil of flanking maneuvers so sudden they felt supernatural. War, at its most human, always births ghosts, and there were ghosts everywhere, not just of men, but of ideas. The myth of the perfect German line gone, the belief in the safety of the rear gone, the illusion that war could be controlled gone. Normandy had shown the world that steel and willpower were no longer enough. The modern battlefield belonged to those who could adapt, who could improvise faster than fear. In a small field near Saint-Denis, a war correspondent found a German diary among the wrecks. The final entry read simply, "They come from the mist. We turn and they are already there." That line would echo across time, a quiet admission that even the greatest war machine on earth can be undone by something as simple as movement and imagination. By the end of July, the American advance broke through the Cotentin Peninsula. The Shermans rolled forward under banners of dust and flame, pushing the Germans into open ground, where air power finished what the tanks had begun. The breakout Operation Cobra tore the Normandy front apart for good. By August, Paris was free. By September, the German army was in retreat. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. And yet, in every after-action report, in every statistic of victory, there was an unspoken understanding among those who lived it, that it wasn't just strategy or numbers that had won Normandy. It was audacity, the willingness to go where no doctrine pointed, the courage to turn the battlefield upside down, the belief that the enemy's rear could be the key to their destruction. Long after the guns fell silent, the people of Normandy would remember the sound, that low, thunderous pulse rolling through the mist, the echo of the Shermans coming from behind. It became part of the land's memory, like the whisper of wind through wheat or the tolling of a distant bell. And when veterans returned years later, gray-haired and quiet, They walked those same fields and felt the ground still humming beneath their feet. As if somewhere deep under the soil, the ghosts of steel still moved, slow, unstoppable, forever advancing through history's fog. The German troops at Normandy had expected the war to come from the front. They never understood, until it was too late, that sometimes victory comes from behind. And in that revelation, in that quiet shift of the world's axis, the modern age of warfare began. The wind still moves gently through the hedgerows of Normandy, the same wind that once carried the smell of smoke and iron and fear. Time has softened the scars, the craters are filled with grass now. The burned-out shells of tanks lie beneath layers of moss. Children play where men once fell. Cows graze on fields that once trembled under artillery. But if you listen closely, when the mist rolls in before dawn, you can still hear it, the faint growl of an engine buried somewhere deep in the earth, moving through memory instead of mud. The farmers here say the land remembers. Every furrow, every stone carries the rhythm of that summer June to July 1944, when the world's future shifted between smoke and thunder. They talk quietly about the tanks that came from behind, how their grandfathers saw them emerge from the fog, how they vanished again before the echo faded. In every village there's still one wall that stands crooked, one tree split down its heart by a shell that never landed right. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through roots and wind. Somewhere between myth and memory, the truth of Normandy lives on. The German soldiers who thought they knew every path, every hedge, every sound, they found themselves lost in their own familiarity. The Americans who crossed those fields, young men far from home, discovered that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet decision made in the dark, a hand steady on a lever, a voice that says, "Go," even when the body wants to stay still. The war didn't end in that moment, but something changed, a lesson buried under every ruined farmhouse and silent road, that control is an illusion, and that adaptability saves nations. Even now, under the calm blue sky of modern Normandy, history feels close enough to touch. Tourists walk along narrow lanes where the hedgerows still stand tall, tangled, ancient. They take photos beside rusted tank tracks, never realizing how many men once vanished into those walls of green. The wind rustles through leaves that once hid both predator and prey. It's as if the earth itself has decided to keep the secret of how the Shermans came from behind, and how the sound of engines in fog became the hymn of liberation. There are museums now, glass cases filled with uniforms, medals, photographs faded to gray. You can see the faces, American, German, French, frozen mid-expression. Some smiling, some staring, some simply tired. The captions tell stories of battalions, units, strategy, but the eyes tell another story. The story of men who didn't think of history or ideology, only survival. In their letters home, you can feel the weight of the moment. "We thought we were going forward," one American wrote. "But in truth, we were circling the world, finding our way back to what it means to be human." When the Allied tanks broke the German lines at St. Lo, it wasn't just a tactical success. It was a psychological fracture. A shift in how wars would be fought forever. From that day on, no general would trust a map the same way again. No army would believe that the front was fixed, that the enemy could only come from one direction. Normandy taught the world that movement was might, that creativity could outfight precision, and that chaos in the right hands could become strategy. Rommel, the desert fox, understood it before anyone else. In his final reports written just weeks before his death, he admitted what few dared to say aloud. "We no longer hold the initiative. The enemy moves like water. He surrounds us, seeps into our defenses. It is no longer war, it is a tide. That tide rising from behind would eventually drown the Third Reich. But it began here in the soft soil of France among the hedgerows that betrayed their builders. And yet, amid all the ruin, Normandy became a place of rebirth. For every field that burned, another bloomed again within a year. For every road destroyed, another was rebuilt by the hands of those who survived. Life returned not with fanfare, but with quiet persistence. Just as the tanks had advanced through fog, so too did peace arrive, uncertain, uneven, but unstoppable. In the years that followed, the survivors aged into silence. Men who once commanded tanks now tended gardens. Those who once dug trenches now dug flower beds. They rarely spoke of what happened, not because they forgot, but because they couldn't explain it. How do you describe the sound of victory when it's mixed with the cries of the fallen? How do you celebrate survival when it came at such a cost? The silence of those men was not denial, it was reverence. And so the stories passed quietly through letters, through diaries, through whispers, through sons who asked their fathers why they woke screaming some nights, through grandsons who stood at the beaches and felt the waves touch their boots, knowing something sacred had happened there long before them. The historians would later call it a turning point. But the truth is softer, less mathematical. It wasn't a turn in the road of war. It was a turn in the soul of mankind. Normandy reminded humanity that victory isn't just destruction, it's creation. The creation of possibility, of courage, of the belief that no line, no wall, no defense can hold back the will to move forward. When you stand in Normandy today, you can still feel it. The air carries a weight that isn't grief exactly, it's gratitude. The bells in the village churches ring differently here, echoing longer, as if sound itself refuses to leave. The sea, far away but ever-present, murmurs the same rhythm that carried the invasion fleet, slow, steady, patient. And if you walk into the fields at dawn, when the mist sits low and the world is still half asleep, you might hear something. A whisper of metal, a pulse beneath the earth. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's the heartbeat of history. Maybe it's the ghost of an engine that never stopped moving, a Sherman tank still advancing somewhere in the fog of time. Some lessons were written in steel and smoke, others in silence. Normandy carries both the noise of battle and the quiet of memory. It is not a monument to victory, but a reminder of what it took to reach it. And as the camera pans over the green fields, the narrator's voice softens, fading into the hum of the countryside. What if they hadn't adapted? What if the tanks had never turned? What if the sound behind the hedgerows had been ignored? The questions linger, unanswered, like echoes in the mist. Because history doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It waits in the soil, in the air, in the way we remember. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, you can still hear the sound of steel moving through fog. Not as a warning anymore, but as a memory of how men learned to fight differently and to hope again. The Shermans came from behind once, but their echo still moves forward.